Rob Kaleel, who's the Executive Director of Lake Michigan Air Directors Consortium. Rob will explain exactly what that is in his presentation, so I won't delve into that, but it's very important for Wisconsin and the Midwestern states, the role that LADCO plays in dealing with large air quality issues. Prior to joining LADCO, Rob worked for more than 30 years at the Illinois EPA, Bureau of Air Quality. He served in varying capacities at the EPA as a staff meteorologist, as a supervisor of the air quality modeling unit, and then as a manager of the air quality planning section. In this capacity, Rob was responsible for regulatory planning for Illinois, including development of state implementation plans, which you'll probably hear a little bit more about today, emissions inventories, and air quality modeling. Rob has also worked as a private consultant as a specialist in air quality modeling and permitting.
Okay, good morning. We got the technology figured out here, so thank you for bearing with me. And wanted to thank Bart and Tracy for introducing me and inviting me to this presentation. I'm very honored to represent this group on this panel. It's been a lot of fun working with this group over the last couple of months to put this material together for you. So as Bart mentioned, I'm going to present more of a zooming in a little bit on more of regional air quality issues on ozone and hopefully offer some perspectives on meeting the new ozone standard. I'll give you a preview ahead of time to my very last slide. There's nothing on there about how to meet the new ozone standard. We have to, we'll be figuring that out as we go forward with our planning process. I'm going to start out my talk with just giving a plug for my organization, the Lake Michigan Air Directors Consortium, and what our role is in regional air quality planning. I'm going to talk a little bit about more regional, Midwestern air quality and emission trends. Some of this will mimic or echo some of the remarks that Arlene made, but perhaps with a little bit more of a Midwestern flavor. And then at least give you some hints about what it might take to meet the new ozone standard. So first, the Lake Michigan Air Directors Consortium. What is LADCO? Maybe some of you are familiar with the work that we've done. We've been around since 1989. We're a nonprofit organization founded by the Midwestern states and EPA. They provide the money to keep us going. We have a staff of 5 people. Our expertise is in areas of emissions inventories, photochemical grid modeling, and monitoring and air quality data analysis. So the technical assessments that is referenced in this slide, that's what we do as modeling and emissions inventories. But that's not all of what LADCO is. LADCO is primarily an organization of the 6 states in the Midwest, all the same states that are in Region 5 are members of LADCO. And really what we're there for is to keep the states talking to each other, provide a forum for discussions, try to jointly plan our approaches to air quality issues. We also have a separate grant that we manage that provides training to air quality professionals in our 6 states. And as we've said a couple of times already, our focus is really on the Midwestern region, although we obviously work with states that are upwind that affect our air quality, and also work with states that are downwind that we impact, or at least that we allegedly impact. So a little bit more about the regional planning organizations. LADCO is just one of several organizations that do some variations of the same thing. We try to get the states together to talk to each other. There's also a big effort between these various RPOs or these planning organizations to talk amongst themselves, again, to try to coordinate the exchanges of data, the exchanges of information, what our strategies are, hopefully to head off legal actions between us, but have some success at that too. So I'd mention one of the things that we do is photochemical grid modeling. This is an example, if you will, of one of the possible outputs. What we're comparing here is base year. 2011 is the base year that we're using for our projections. Measured data for the 2011 base year against projections made by our air quality modeling. 2011, I mentioned, is the base year. 2017, which isn't too far down the road, is the projection year. That is the year that non-attainment areas for the 2008 ozone standard are expected to attain the standard. The color scales, we kind of make them go red, if you will, at the 75 part per billion level of the 2008 standard. So in the 2011 base year, again, those are measured values. Those are the areas in red and orange are those areas that were violating the standard in that year or in the couple of years straddling 2011. The 2017, again, is a projection. We're using 2011 meteorological conditions, but we're adjusting the emissions inventory to reflect growth in the economy, growth in population, but also the effects of control strategies that are expected by 2017. And of course, you can see dramatic improvements between 2011 and 2017. One little dot point there on Lake Michigan, that's Sheboygan, Wisconsin, and I'll through my presentation talk about Sheboygan repeatedly. That's always been one of the more stubborn or more difficult locations to be able to meet the ozone standard for a lot of reasons, given its geography and location on Lake Michigan and its location downwind of the Chicago metropolitan area. So I'll come back to the Sheboygan issue. But again, this is one of the things that we can do with the models, and to me, it's a good news story. Most areas that were violating the ozone standard in 2011 should have no problem attaining it in 2017, with the possible exception of Sheboygan. So let's look for a moment at more recent air quality data. Again, this is looking at measured air quality data, and we've incorporated now the 2015 data, the data that just for the ozone summer that we're now getting through. Bart had mentioned earlier the concept of design values. Design value is a 3-year construct. It doesn't represent any one particular year. It's looking at the 4th high values from each of 3 successive years for a given location and averaging it. So it's kind of a weird statistical construct, but that's what we use to compare to the standard. We thought we were going to make it this summer. We were real close to meeting the 75 part per billion standard. A very strong ozone conducive episode around Labor Day unfortunately has pushed a couple of the monitors in the Lake Michigan region, including Sheboygan and Holland, Michigan, above the 75 part per billion standard. So we didn't make it for the last 3-year period. And regulatory from that perspective, we'll have to see what that ultimately means in terms of any regulatory actions that either the state of Michigan or the state of Wisconsin has to pursue. But I thought you'd like to see where we stood, at least with current air quality measurements. Nope, went the wrong way, sorry. Ozone levels over the last 20, 25 years have improved dramatically. Arlene made this point. This slide, I think, makes it very well as well. This slide is constructed using monitoring data from all the monitors in the 6-state LADCO region. We call it the LADCO region. Region 5 calls it the Region 5 region. I'm not sure who's right about that, but at any rate, this box whisker plot shows both the range of values, design values across all the 100 monitors in the region, but also gives you an idea. The midpoint of that box would represent the average of all monitors in our 6 states. And if you just connect the midpoints of those boxes through this 25-year period, the evidence for improved ozone is very dramatic, especially since about 2002, 2003, 2004, which coincides with the implementation of the NOx SIP call, the first effort on the part of EPA and the states to control ozone regionally. And with 2015 data, of course, our ozone trend in a downward direction continues. This isn't by accident. The ozone is responding very, very dramatically to the emission reductions that have happened in that period. I've highlighted just the reductions in NOx emissions. As Arlene had mentioned before, ozone there's 2 main groups of precursor emissions, VOCs and NOx. The focus over the last 20 years or so, properly so, has been on NOx, and I'm showing the emission trends just for NOx, for transportation, stationary fuel combustion, i.e. power plants, and also other industrial processes. If I was to show a VOC slide, which I didn't put together, you'd see equally dramatic reductions in VOC emissions. And again, you can see the effects of that on air quality. Again, Arlene showed a slide similar to this. This is a very dramatic depiction of NO2 air quality put together by NASA and the ACAS team, which you've heard a little bit about. And I think there's another session on satellite measurements later today. And this actual measured NO2 concentrations across the eastern U.S. comparing 2005 to 2011. And from space, you can see very dramatic improvements, again, owing to the dramatic reductions of emissions that I showed in the previous slide. So let's talk about the new ozone standard. Again, this slide is representing measured air quality, not modeled air quality. It's using the same 2013 to 2015 data I showed you a minute ago, but I've adjusted the color scales here to reflect the new standard, which is shown here as red. Each of the dots represent monitor locations in the Midwest, and those dots that are shown in red are the ones that, at least using current air quality data, are not meeting the standard. A little bit about the regulatory process going forward. About a year from now, the states are expected to make recommendations to EPA as to which of their areas are not meeting the air quality standard. I think that recommendation is due to EPA next October. Whether or not the states will have a complete 2016 air quality database to make that recommendation is a little bit unclear to me at the moment. It'll be close whether or not the states have quality assured their data in time to use 2016 data. Assuming they don't have that data available, this is what they're going to be presenting to EPA, and can expect non-attainment recommendations for at least some counties in Lake Michigan area, St. Louis, Cincinnati, Detroit, Cleveland, Columbus, so you can see them on the map. So several non-attainment, potential non-attainment issues in the Midwest based on this year's data. I'd mentioned that the states make their recommendation next year. EPA will take a year after that, up until 2017, to make the final decision about non-attainment boundaries. So this isn't exactly the data that EPA will be looking at. They will certainly have 2016 data to look at, and perhaps even 2017 data to make that final decision. But at least you get a rough idea what it is we're going to be looking at in terms of that regulatory designation. So where is the ozone coming from? This is a great slide. It was put together by a newspaper in Florida quite a long time ago. This came out during the Ozone Transport Assessment Group, the OTAG process. Maybe some of you are familiar with the OTAG process. I was heavily involved in it back in the 1990s. It was the first effort on the part of the states to come to grips with transport from one state to another. I think this was undoubtedly constructed with a tongue-in-cheek or cynical poke at the states for constantly wanting to shift the blame to other states. But there's some truth in it, and that's what OTAG was all about, was to try to see what the contributions were from one state to another and what could ultimately be done with it. Mentioned there's some truth to it. This is not the result or a graphic that was put together by a newspaper columnist or cartoonist. This was actually constructed from model output for 2017, looking at the contributions of various states to the non-attainment problem in Sheboygan, again in the year 2017. And Wisconsin's got good reason to be looking at upwind states for help. This particular slice of the pie is roughly 9 or 10% of the total ozone at Sheboygan comes from sources in Wisconsin. So we probably all know where to look next. Illinois could probably make the same argument that most of their ozone comes from somewhere else. Illinois, certainly in Chicago, being the northern part of the state, and Illinois being a nice long north-south state with southerly winds on high ozone days, Illinois' contribution is higher, about 20%. but most of the ozone comes from somewhere else. So where to look? We're always looking for that most cost-effective control strategy, where to find it. A lot of these areas that we expect will be non-attainment for the next round of ozone designations have been non-attainment for 25 years, back from the original Clean Air Act in the even before 1990s. So these areas have implemented controls after controls after controls. It's going to be hard to find local emission reductions in the non-attainment areas to solve the problem. So there's good reason to look regionally for solutions. One of the places to look and has been the focus for many rulemakings and very many emission reductions are coal-fired power plants. What this slide depicts, again, it's a projection based on where we think coal-fired power plants will be in terms of their NOx emissions in 2018, just a couple of years from now. Excuse me. The size of the circles represent the size of the emissions in tons per year. If I was to show you a slide from 20 years ago, it would look much more dramatic, especially in the Midwest. You'd see much larger circles. The Ohio River Valley, there's obviously a lot of coal-fired power plants. There's still a lot of NOx emissions there, but that low-hanging fruit there in the Midwest is gone. But it's not, or it's reducing. I shouldn't say it's completely gone. There's still some opportunities there from the EGU sector. And EPA is looking at a revised transport rule, perhaps as early as this year, again, to see if we can tease out further reductions from coal-fired utilities. But there's other places to look. This is another depiction of apportionment of contributions to ozone levels in Sheboygan. This is kind of rank ordering the states that are contributing to ozone levels in Sheboygan. Obviously, Illinois is the biggest contributor there, but Wisconsin and Indiana, again, not surprisingly, being the next biggest contributors to ozone levels in Sheboygan. What I wanted to draw your attention to is the bar showing Great Lakes. And also, I should have mentioned the color scales on each of those bars, which show the source sectors, the emission sectors that contribute to ozone levels. EGU controls is the one shown in red. It's a fairly small part of the problem from each particular state. What we're seeing, and my next slide will highlight that a lot better, is very large contributions from on-road and off-road mobile. And getting back to that yellow bar there, the third bar that you're seeing that's labeled as Great Lakes, this is something we've just started looking at. We think there's perhaps a very significant contribution from commercial marine vessels on the Great Lakes, or in the case of Sheboygan, the vessels on Lake Michigan. That's what that yellow bar represents. It's the category called off-road marine, or off-road mobile sources, but as part of that is marine aircraft rail, that MAR, that's what that stands for. So that's something we're starting to look at, is the contributions from commercial vessels, and that isn't something I don't think we've focused on much in the Midwest in prior years. Putting together those bar charts of the various source sectors into one chart here, again, it highlights the contributions of various emission source sectors at Sheboygan. Electric utilities, about 12%, industrial sources, 16%. But look at the purple and the green there. Those represent the mobile sources, both on-road vehicles and off-road vehicles. That's more than 50% of the ozone from man-made sources at Sheboygan. So it's clearly a place we're going to have to look for attaining the next round of, or next ozone standard. So let's take a look at those categories for a moment. These are the emission strengths, if you will, of the on-road mobile sources. Not surprisingly, the major contributors in terms of emissions in the Midwest are heavy-duty trucks on road, the diesel trucks, also the light-duty vehicles, the cars and vans and SUVs that are on highway. We don't see a lot from light-duty vehicles. It's not your neighbor's Volkswagen that's contributing real largely, although we might need to revisit the emissions inventory based on recent news, but we know where they are. If you drive on the interstates around here, you see the trucks, you see the cars on the highway, especially at 5 o'clock or on the weekends outside of Madison heading north or south. You see lots and lots of on-road vehicles. In terms of the non-road, the off-road, if you will, non-road sources, rail and diesel equipment. What do I mean by equipment? These are construction equipment, agricultural equipment, generators, compressors, things like that that burn diesel fuel that are not on our roadways but are otherwise mobile. Interestingly, at least with our most recent round of emissions inventories, commercial marine vessels isn't showing up real strongly there. You recall the contribution that we think commercial marine is making at places like Sheboygan. This emissions inventory, at least from this slide, doesn't seem to support that, but keep in mind those ships are buzzing right by Sheboygan. So even though on a regional basis, when you sum up all the emissions from 6 states, it doesn't look like a real significant contributor. These emissions are happening right where the action is over Lake Michigan. We think the emissions, the NOx emissions primarily from these vessels, combining with VOC and NOx emissions from Chicago area, are contributing strongly in the Great Lakes region and in Sheboygan. This slide, I should mention, is a track of the commercial vessels on Lake Michigan, or actually on all the Great Lakes across an entire shipping season. So you can kind of get a good feel for where those ships are going. Pardon me. We have a project right now at LADCO. We're trying to improve our emissions inventory for commercial marine vessels. We found this really cool website, marinetraffic.com. If you have a few moments and your boss isn't looking, it's kind of fun to go out there and take a look. You can click on any one of these little spots on the map, and it would bring up information about what specific ship is being looked at. And from that specific information, you know the size of the engine, you know how much fuel, you know if they're going or coming, how heavy the fuel is, how hard those engines are working, and from that be able to generate an emissions inventory. And this data is supplied to the Coast Guard in terms of the vessel loading and offloading. The vessels themselves, of course, are equipped with GPS equipment, so we know on a minute-by-minute basis where these ships are at, and you accumulate that data across the summer, which we're doing right now, and you get a real good idea of how active they are, how much NOx emissions are coming from them, and at what time of day, what time of week, what time of year. So we're working on that right now and hope to have some results that we can share with our states here over the next couple of weeks. Other control measures. Before we start looking at new stuff that might be needed to meet the ozone standard, one of the things we want to do to be able to project their quality is to get a good tabulation of the control measures that the regulations are already in place. Companies are already looking to implement these control measures. This is really just a partial list of these measures. Hopefully you can read that back there, but the first 3 of those all deal with power plant emissions, the mercury and air toxic standards, the earlier version of the cross-state air pollution rule, and I'm forecasting ahead here a little bit the 2008 air quality standard. We expect that EPA is going to come out with a rulemaking very soon to look at transport for that standard. In the next couple of years, we would expect EPA to modify the cross-state air pollution rule to address the new standard, but they haven't even dealt with 2008 yet, owing largely to the litigation that has involved all of these rulemakings. All of them have implementation dates that are still out in the future yet, so not all the emission reductions have occurred yet. So we expect to see some improvement from electric generating units that will help us meet the new standard. The remaining list of control measures that are listed there are all mobile source measures, both on-road measures and off-road measures. You'll notice, for the most part, these final rules have been rolling out over the last 10 years or so, and some of the initial implementation dates of these rules have already come and gone, but we're still expecting a lot of emission reductions from these categories. The emission standards here, for the most part, are on the development or the rollout of new engines. There's some fuel parts of this that have already happened that have reduced emissions. But the rollout of new engines takes a long time. There's a whole fleet turnover process that has to happen. It's probably a 25-year cycle for on-road light-duty vehicles, people driving their cars for 20, 25 years, maybe longer. That cycle is much longer for diesel vehicles. There's a lot of old diesels that are on the road and will continue to be. And I think most of these standards, if those diesel engines are rebuilt, they have to meet the new standards. So we expect to see continuing improvements of NOx and VOC emissions from these mobile source programs well beyond the implementation date or the attainment date that's expected for the new standard. So these will help. We're going to try to tabulate these and get these in the model and try to project their quality for whatever year, whether it's 2020, 2023. Depending on the non-attainment classification for our areas, we'll model those future years and see what improvements we can expect from these measures. So with that, I'll turn it back to Bart, our next speaker. Thank you.